Good morning. Today, the theme of our service is practicing joy, and our passages, Philippians chapter 4, verses 1 and 4 through 9, have a lot to say about it. In this letter, Paul is calling out to his friends in the city of Philippi, a church that he started with his close friend Timothy, and the first church in Europe. In this friendly letter, Paul thanks them for their faith and lets them know that he is safe. Paul has been put in prison for teaching about Jesus, but continues to do so, even to the prison guards. Paul's challenges do not challenge his faith. He is rejoicing in the Lord and finding the good in his situation, even though he is facing potential execution. Paul calls out for his friends in Philippi to rejoice in the Lord always. And this seems pretty unbelievable, especially coming from a man who is in jail. How are we supposed to rejoice in the Lord when we are stuck inside, isolated from our friends and family, losing our jobs, struggling to get by and support our families, and weighed down by the doors that have been closed in our faces? How silly of you, Paul, to ask us to rejoice. But Paul knows this pain too. These words come from a man who could be beheaded at any moment, simply for declaring his love of Christ. Paul knew our pain, our suffering, and our deprivation tenfold. So we cannot assume that he doesn't know the heartache that we are currently facing. Through this theme of joy, Paul is calling us to something outside of ourselves and despite our circumstances. We are encouraged to find a stabilizing voice in God and confidence in his protection through prayer, to find a deep-rooted joy that is not tied to a favorite food, money, or ease of living. Paul is calling us to find joy through our confidence in Christ. How can we talk about joy without talking about the opposite of joy? In verses 6 and 7, Paul says, "Do not worry about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." The New International Version of the Bible has translated this verse to say, "Do not be anxious about anything." And yet, worry and anxiety have been prevalent throughout this unprecedented year. We feel anxious about everything. But what is anxiety? Anxiety is uneasiness, worry, or distress about a situation that is either current or impending. In this passage, Paul is reminding us that in order to be anxious about nothing, we have to be prayerful about everything, suggesting that prayer is an antidote to anxiety. As they are juxtaposed, we can see where they stand. Anxiety is rooted in self, while prayer is rooted in God. Anxiety is a concern over circumstances that you cannot control, and prayer is the removal of this doubt by replacing it with confidence in Him. Anxiety is an expression of fear, and prayer is an expression of faith. No matter if doors are opening or closing for us, by making our faith and confidence known to Him, we are rejoicing in our circumstances. In 2020, it was easy to be self-focused, and there were many problems that needed to be solved. We felt out of control, and we were fearful of almost everything. Whether you were concerned about the economy, losing a job, sick family members, being away from family, not being in school, canceled graduations and proms, having to teach your children, isolation, being away from grandchildren, empty grocery stores, finding toilet paper, COVID birthdays, canceling a vacation, or the inability to be with a spouse during the birth of a child, the fact that you didn't qualify for a stimulus check, or even your dog's developing separation anxiety. All of this punctuated by our Derry community being ripped from our grasps when churches transitioned online. We were not alone. It was difficult to remember that, though. It was difficult to pray with thanksgiving. Sometimes it was difficult to pray at all. Like all of you, I had my share of joys, anxieties, and moments of prayer this past year, including the loss of the end of my school year when the whole structure of my school was changed, the inability to see friends, which led to drifting apart, a canceled youth group trip to Montreat, canceled college visits, feelings of isolation, being unable to spend time with my family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, especially for holidays and birthdays. Changes and cancellations of extracurricular activities, and the loss of youth connections at church due to the broad risk factors, because none of us were in the same bubbles otherwise. These lists feel completely dismal, and like the only thing we can find within them is a record of the immense loss that we have each experienced. Through reflection, though, this is not what I see. Through each loss and anxiety, there is opportunity. Mr. Rogers once said, "Often when you think you're at the end of something, you're at the beginning of something else." If one door had not closed, there would not be an opportunity for a new one to open. Here I am reminded and wish to remind all of you that Paul says, "Rejoice in the Lord always." Again, I will say, rejoice. In the fall of this year, every activity that I loved was no longer available to me. I was unable to see the people I wanted to see, and I felt isolated. I forgot to pray. I forgot to be thankful despite the circumstances. I forgot to pray for the closed doors. And when I did pray, I was seeking answers, not peace. I was angry at God for letting this happen. Recently, I have become deeply involved in an initiative with my school that has had an immense impact on my perspective of the world and how I view my community. Sometimes I wonder why it was entrusted to me of all people. I am working with one of my classmates to coordinate the planting of 5,000 trees across Lancaster County in order to divert 3.6 million gallons of contaminated water from local streams and at the same time offset 130 million miles of car emissions. This is a door that was open to me at a time in my life when I felt low and so empty. However, if certain doors in my life had not closed during COVID, I never ever would have been able to accept the opportunity to take on this project. And it has been one of the best experiences of my life. This project is changing my perspective of myself and helping me to understand all of the things that I am capable of. This event is just starting to go public, and from the outside, it appears to be just a couple of high school students with far too much ambition. In fact, we've heard that many times, time after time. People have told us that our goal is too high, our time is too short, and the logistics are simply too complicated for a time such as this. I'm sure you're wondering what this project is and why it is so big. Well, being big is in our name. We're called the Big Do, and we are challenging hundreds of local people, students and community members, to join us in the planting of these 5,000 trees by the beginning of June, punctuated with a celebration of local music, culture, climate change, and social justice work. And yes, this June. We want to make change loud. We want to be heard. While at times through the past year, I was not thankful for closed doors and lost opportunities, I now see these changes as some of my greatest blessings. I've also come to know that had it not been for the church leadership opportunities that I have been afforded, like elbowing my way into being the first youth deacon and the opportunity to serve on the youth leadership team, I would not have had the same confidence in myself. These opportunities transformed my leadership abilities, and as I spoke about them through my college application process, I had the chance to reflect on my statement of faith from confirmation. Almost exactly 3 years ago, I wrote my statement of faith and included a passage from the Bible as a guide for my faith. Coincidentally, the passage was Philippians chapter 4, verse 7. "And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Reflecting on these passages now, I realize that hand in hand with kindness and understanding comes joy. Especially this year and going forward, joy has been and will be a lifeline for us. And I have seen this reflected through every area of my life, church, school, and home. Recently, I've begun to think about a return to church. At the beginning of the pandemic, for many of us, our goal was to return to normal as quickly as possible. We wanted to remain in the same place with our worship, school, and family experiences. We wanted our relationships with these communities to stay the same as they had always been. Through the pandemic, the door to the normalcy that we once knew has been irreversibly closed. Our worship experience is forever changed, and by returning to what we would consider a normal worship service, we would be cutting off members of our community from around the country who worship with us weekly, and local members who are yet unable to return in person. While we as a church community could see this as a loss, it is okay to be thankful for this change. We have had to make incredible choices without being able to clearly see what is coming next. We can only make the next best right choice. Again, as Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. Let this be a reminder to us to rejoice in everything with thanksgiving, especially the unanswered prayers. Many times we spend our days praying for answers or praying for something specific. And when we don't receive the answer we are looking for, we feel as though God has abandoned us. Paul reminds us that through each loss and anxiety, there is an opportunity, as long as we choose joy and peace through our confidence in Christ. We have to have confidence like Paul does, knowing that God is in control regardless of the outcome. This doesn't mean that we should follow him with blind optimism, but that we should choose faith. Whatever we do, whatever comes next, we should do our best to do as Paul recommends in verse 9. Keep on doing the things that we have learned and received and heard and seen in him, and the God of peace will be with us. Paul is calling us to find joy through our confidence in Christ. We must do what we think is right and have confidence that we will find peace through prayer, and God will guide us and be a stabilizing voice in our lives as we rejoice despite the circumstances.